This book is not designed to increase your motivation, improve your confidence, or help you believe in yourself. Those approaches fail because they operate below the level where behavior is actually decided. What you are about to hear is a mechanical explanation of how human identities are formed, protected, and reinforced, and how high performers stop being controlled by this process by taking conscious ownership of it. By listening to this book, you will understand three core realities. First, you will understand that you are already self-brainwashing every day. Your habits, impulses, procrastination, ambition, and avoidance are not character flaws. They are automatic outputs of an identity doing exactly what it was designed to do: preserve itself. This book explains why willpower, motivation, and discipline consistently fail, not because you lack effort, but because they directly threaten identity stability. Second, you will understand how beliefs actually work. Beliefs are not thoughts or statements in your mind. They are emotional conclusions formed from accumulated evidence. Most people try to change beliefs with affirmations and positive thinking. High performers generate belief change through repeated action. This book will show you why action is the interface with reality, and why no change is sustainable if it starts with thoughts or emotions. Third, you will learn how to replace unconscious self-conditioning with a deliberate system, not through visualization, motivation rituals, or mindset hacks, but through measurable inputs, small, frequent, strategically designed actions that generate enough emotional evidence to force identity to update. By the end of this book, you will not have more motivation. You will have fewer internal options. Resistance will no longer feel like a problem. It will reveal exactly where your identity is protecting itself. And once you understand that mechanism, change stops being a matter of desire and becomes a matter of engineering. Chapter 1. You are already brainwashed. Most people believe their behavior is the result of conscious choice. They believe they decide when to act, when to stop, when to push, and when to quit. When they fail, they explain it as a lack of discipline, focus, or motivation. When they succeed, they describe it as a moment when they finally tried hard enough. This belief is incorrect. Your behavior is not primarily governed by choice. It is governed by identity preservation. You are not undecided. You are already conditioned. Long before you evaluate options, your nervous system has already filtered what feels acceptable, what feels excessive, and what feels threatening. Every human operates inside a system that constantly answers a single question: who am I allowed to be? That answer silently dictates how much effort feels normal, how much discomfort feels tolerable, and how long persistence feels reasonable. Conscious thought arrives later, usually to justify a decision that has already been made. If waking up early feels difficult, that is not laziness. If starting feels painful but stopping feels relieving, that is not a flaw. If consistency collapses after a few days, that is not a willpower issue. It is identity enforcing stability. The system is not malfunctioning. It is working exactly as designed. Conditioning is not optional. The term brainwashing makes people uncomfortable because they associate it with external control, manipulation, or coercion. That framing is misleading. Brainwashing is not something that happens to a person. It is something the nervous system does automatically in response to repeated input. Every repeated action teaches the brain what is normal. Every avoided action teaches the brain what is unsafe. Every emotional reaction teaches the brain what to expect next time. Over time, these lessons are compressed into a stable internal model. That model is what most people call who I am. Identity is not a personality trait. It is a predictive system. Your brain is constantly estimating how much effort you usually apply, how much discomfort you tolerate before quitting, how seriously you take long-term outcomes, and how reliably you follow through. Once these predictions stabilize, behavior follows automatically. Motivation becomes irrelevant. This is why change feels like friction. When you attempt to behave outside your established identity, resistance appears immediately. Most people interpret this resistance as fear, doubt, procrastination, or lack of confidence. They assume something has gone wrong and try to eliminate the feeling. This is a fundamental misunderstanding. Resistance is not a malfunction. It is feedback. It is the sensation of identity detecting a threat to its existing structure. From the brain's perspective, change is not improvement. Change is instability. Instability signals risk. The system responds the same way it would respond to physical danger, by pushing you back toward what is familiar. This is why bursts of motivation fail so reliably. Motivation temporarily increases output without altering the underlying identity. The system allows the deviation briefly, then restores equilibrium. You experience this as losing momentum or falling off. The system experiences it as correction. Willpower is the attempt to override identity with conscious effort. It feels noble. It also fails predictably. Conscious effort is slow, metabolically expensive, and limited. Identity-driven behavior is fast, automatic, and efficient. When the two are in conflict, identity always wins. Not because you are weak, but because the architecture favors efficiency over aspiration. This explains a pattern most people recognize but cannot explain. You can act differently for a day, sometimes for a week, occasionally for a month, and then revert. The plan was reasonable. The intention was genuine. The collapse was inevitable. You tried to intervene below the level where behavior is generated. Identity exists to reduce cognitive load. Your brain does not want to renegotiate every decision every day. Instead of asking whether you should train, work, focus, or quit, it asks a simpler and faster question. What do people like me do in situations like this? Once that question is answered, action executes automatically. This is why identity feels solid and personal. This is why change feels threatening. This is why criticism cuts deeper than logic suggests it should. You are not defending a specific action. You are defending a model of who you believe yourself to be. There is a loop most people never consciously see. Identity establishes an emotional baseline. That baseline shapes automatic thoughts. Those thoughts guide repeated actions. Repeated actions generate results. Those results are interpreted as evidence. That evidence is then used to reinforce identity. Motivation does not initiate this loop. Thoughts do not control it. They are outputs, not drivers. Trying to change behavior by thinking differently is like trying to alter a reflection without touching the object creating it. The loop is self-reinforcing because it continuously produces evidence. Every time you act in alignment with your current identity, you confirm it. The brain records the outcome and updates one conclusion. This is accurate. Preserve it. High performers are not immune to this process. They are not special cases. They are simply conditioned deliberately. At some point, they stopped waiting to feel ready. They stopped negotiating with resistance. They stopped interpreting discomfort as a signal to retreat. They constructed identities where certain actions were normal and others were not even considered. This did not happen through motivation. It happened through repetition. The difference is not desire or ambition. It is evidence density. Their past behavior generates momentum for future behavior. For most people, past behavior generates friction instead. When people fail to change, they personalize the failure. They label themselves inconsistent, lazy, or broken. This language feels honest, even responsible. In reality, it reinforces the very identity producing the behavior. The system hears confirmation and stabilizes further. Self-blame does not produce change. It deepens the groove. You cannot shame a system into changing its own architecture. You cannot insult yourself into a new identity. Once you accept that you are already conditioned, only one question remains. Is that conditioning accidental or deliberate? If you do nothing, the system will continue updating itself based on convenience, comfort, environment, social norms, and emotional avoidance. That path produces predictable outcomes, not because the world is unfair, but because the inputs never change. This book does not ask you to fight yourself. It explains how the system that produces you actually works. It shows how to intervene at the only level where change is durable. That intervention requires one non-negotiable shift. You must stop treating resistance as an enemy and start treating it as evidence of where identity is anchored. Only then does real change become possible. In the next chapter, you will see why willpower fails mechanically, not philosophically, and why any system built on force eventually collapses back to the identity it was trying to escape. Chapter 2. Why willpower always fails. Willpower is commonly treated as a virtue. In practice, it is a failure mode. Most systems of self-improvement assume that the correct sequence is understanding, motivation, effort, result. When results fail to appear, the conclusion is that effort was insufficient. The prescription is always the same. Try harder next time. This model ignores how the nervous system actually allocates energy. Willpower is conscious override. It requires sustained attention, emotional suppression, and repeated decision-making. From a biological perspective, it is expensive. The brain did not evolve to operate primarily through conscious force. It evolved to conserve energy by automating behavior wherever possible. Identity-based behavior is automation. Willpower is manual control. Whenever you rely on willpower, you are attempting to temporarily override a system designed to outlast you. You are asking a slow, fragile, resource-limited process to dominate a fast, efficient, self-correcting one. This imbalance guarantees eventual failure. This is not a moral statement, it is a mechanical one. Every act of willpower increases cognitive load. Every decision you consciously force consumes attention. Every moment of internal debate drains metabolic resources. Over time, the brain responds the same way it responds to any inefficient process. It shuts it down. This is why willpower feels heroic in the moment and unsustainable over time. It works briefly because novelty increases dopamine and focus. Then novelty decays. The chemical support disappears. The cost remains. The system reverts to its baseline. People misinterpret this collapse as weakness. In reality, it is conservation. The nervous system is not interested in your long-term aspirations. It is interested in maintaining stability, predictability, and energy efficiency. When willpower-driven behavior threatens those priorities, the system intervenes. Fatigue appears. Distraction increases. Justifications multiply. Eventually, execution stops, not because you chose to quit, because the system withdrew support. This explains why willpower feels strongest at the beginning of change and weakest when consistency is required most. Early effort is tolerated as an anomaly. Sustained deviation is treated as a threat. The longer you rely on force, the more resistance accumulates. This is also why willpower-based systems collapse catastrophically rather than gradually. You do not slowly taper off, you break. One missed day becomes several. One exception becomes abandonment. The system does not negotiate partial compliance. It restores equilibrium. This pattern repeats across domains: training, work, learning, relationships. The specifics change, the mechanism does not. Willpower also creates an internal adversarial dynamic. One part of you becomes the enforcer. Another becomes the one being controlled. This division generates constant internal negotiation. Negotiation is friction. Friction reduces execution. High performers do not win because they exert more force. They win because they eliminate the need for force. They do not wake up and decide whether to act. The decision has already been made by identity. Conscious thought is not required to initiate behavior. It is only required to execute logistics. This is the critical distinction most people never see. Willpower asks, "Can I make myself do this?" Identity asks, "Is this what someone like me does?" The first requires effort. The second requires none. When behavior is identity consistent, it feels neutral, not exciting, not heroic, normal. This neutrality is mistaken for lack of ambition. In reality, it is the absence of internal resistance. People who rely on willpower believe resistance is proof of importance. They assume that if something feels hard, it must be meaningful. This belief traps them in cycles of force and collapse. Difficulty becomes addictive. Stability becomes suspicious. High performers interpret resistance differently. They see it as a signal that the behavior has not yet been normalized. The solution is not more force. The solution is more evidence. Willpower attempts to overpower resistance. Conditioning dissolves it. This is why willpower cannot be trained indefinitely. You cannot strengthen it without limit. Even the most disciplined individuals eventually plateau if identity does not shift. The ceiling is structural, not personal. This also explains why discipline deteriorates under stress. Stress consumes the same resources willpower depends on. When life becomes unpredictable, the system prioritizes survival efficiency. Optional effort is the first thing removed. Identity-based behavior survives stress because it reduces decision load. Under pressure, you default to who you are, not who you intended to be. This is the core failure of force-based change. It assumes stability in conditions and infinite access to energy. Neither assumption is valid. If willpower were sufficient, relapse would be rare. Instead, relapse is the rule. The correct conclusion is not that people are flawed. The correct conclusion is that the method is incompatible with the system. You do not need more self-control. You need less dependence on control. This requires a different intervention point. You must stop trying to command behavior and start shaping the system that generates it. That system does not respond to arguments or intentions. It responds to patterns. Identity updates only when it detects consistency, not intensity, not sincerity, consistency. This is why small actions matter more than dramatic ones. Not because they are easier, but because they are repeatable. Repeatability is what produces evidence. Evidence is what rewrites identity. Willpower creates spikes. Identity creates trajectories. In the next chapter, you will see what beliefs actually are from the brain's perspective, why they resist logic, and why no amount of understanding can remove a belief that has been emotionally reinforced through repetition. Chapter 3. Belief is emotional compression. Beliefs are commonly treated as conclusions. In reality, they are shortcuts. From the brain's perspective, a belief is not a statement about truth. It is a decision about what requires no further evaluation. Once something becomes a belief, the system stops analyzing it. That is its function. This is why beliefs feel stable and personal. They are compressed judgments created to reduce cognitive load. The brain cannot afford to reevaluate everything continuously. It needs fixed reference points to move quickly. Beliefs provide those anchors. This also explains why arguing with a belief rarely works. Logic operates slowly and conditionally. Belief operates quickly and absolutely. When the two conflict, belief wins by default, not because it is correct, but because it is efficient. Beliefs form through repetition paired with emotion. The emotional component is critical. Repetition alone creates familiarity. Emotion tags familiarity as significant. When the same conclusion is reached repeatedly under emotional load, the brain compresses it into a belief. This is why emotionally charged experiences shape identity disproportionately. One humiliating failure can outweigh dozens of neutral successes. One intense victory can override years of mediocrity. Emotion acts as a multiplier on evidence. Once compressed, beliefs become filters. They shape perception before conscious thought appears. Information that aligns with the belief is noticed, remembered, and reinforced. Information that contradicts it is ignored, discounted, or reinterpreted. This is not bias in the moral sense. It is architecture. The brain is not designed to seek objective truth. It is designed to maintain internal coherence. Beliefs are the tools it uses to preserve that coherence. This is why beliefs feel self-evident. They are not constantly defended because they are not constantly questioned. The questioning mechanism has been bypassed. Belief signals closure. From that point forward, behavior is guided automatically. If you believe effort rarely pays off, hesitation will feel rational. If you believe consistency is unnatural for you, quitting will feel justified. If you believe discomfort is dangerous, avoidance will feel intelligent. None of these behaviors feel like sabotage. They feel like common sense. Beliefs also regulate emotional baselines. They determine what level of stress feels normal, what level of effort feels excessive, and what outcomes feel realistic. This emotional calibration is more influential than conscious goals. You can want something intellectually while believing emotionally that it is not for you. In that case, behavior will align with belief, not desire. This is why affirmations fail. Repeating a statement without emotional evidence does not compress into belief. The system registers it as noise. Worse, the contrast between the statement and lived behavior reinforces the opposite. Conclusion: the brain trusts what you do more than what you say. Beliefs are not updated by information. They are updated by evidence. Evidence is not data. Evidence is experienced outcome. This distinction is critical. You can know something is possible and still believe it is not for you. Knowledge is abstract. Belief is personal. Belief answers a specific question. What usually happens when I act like this? That answer is drawn from memory, not reasoning. Memory is weighted by emotion and recency. The system asks, what has been reliably true in my experience? It does not ask what could be true in theory. This is why people remain trapped in patterns they intellectually reject. The belief is not upheld by argument. It is upheld by history. To change a belief, you must change what history appears to show. This does not require dramatic events. It requires consistent evidence that contradicts the existing compression. Small actions repeated under manageable emotional load create new data points. Over time, the brain is forced to update its prediction model. This update does not feel like a revelation. It feels like a quiet shift in what seems normal. Behavior changes first. Language follows later. High performers understand this implicitly. They do not attempt to persuade themselves. They design routines that generate proof. They let the brain draw its own conclusions. This is why belief change feels indirect. You do not decide to believe. You behave in a way that makes an alternative belief unavoidable. The process is slow by design. Rapid belief shifts are unstable unless backed by massive emotional impact. Most sustainable change occurs through accumulation, not conversion. Beliefs resist change because they are protecting efficiency. Updating them too easily would destabilize the system. The brain prefers being wrong consistently over being right intermittently. This is why consistency beats intensity. Intensity creates spikes. Spikes do not compress well. Consistency creates patterns. Patterns become predictions. Predictions become beliefs. You do not need to fight your beliefs. You need to feed the system different evidence. In the next chapter, you will see how identity emerges from belief networks, why it resists change so aggressively, and why discomfort appears precisely when you are doing the correct thing. Chapter 4. Identity is a self-preserving system. Identity is commonly described as personality, character, or self-image. None of these definitions are operationally useful. From the nervous system's perspective, identity is a control system. Its function is not self-expression. Its function is stability. Identity exists to predict behavior and reduce uncertainty. It answers one continuous question on behalf of the brain. What will this organism do next? Once that prediction becomes reliable, the system defends it aggressively. This is why identity feels solid. It is not a narrative. It is a set of expectations encoded through repetition. The brain does not care who you want to be. It cares who you have been. Past behavior is the strongest predictor of future behavior, and identity is the mechanism that enforces that prediction. Every identity is built from belief clusters. These beliefs are not abstract statements. They are emotionally weighted conclusions drawn from repeated experience. Together they form a model of what actions are typical, what efforts are excessive, and what outcomes are realistic for someone like you. Once this model stabilizes, behavior becomes automatic. This is the part most people miss. Identity does not require motivation. It removes the need for it. Actions aligned with identity feel neutral. They do not require negotiation or encouragement. They simply occur. This neutrality is often misunderstood. People assume that high performers must feel constantly driven or inspired. In reality, most of their execution feels mundane. The absence of friction is mistaken for ease. It is not ease, it is alignment. Identity preserves itself through emotional signaling. When behavior aligns with identity, the nervous system remains calm. When behavior deviates, the system produces discomfort. That discomfort is not random, it is corrective. Anxiety, doubt, boredom, and procrastination are not signs of weakness. They are signals that a deviation is occurring. The system is attempting to restore equilibrium. From a survival standpoint, this makes sense. Sudden changes in behavior historically correlated with risk. Conservatism was adaptive. Exploration was costly. Identity is the modern manifestation of that ancient bias. This is why even positive change triggers resistance. The system does not distinguish between beneficial and harmful deviation. It distinguishes between familiar and unfamiliar. Familiar feels safe. Unfamiliar feels dangerous. Most people misinterpret this signal. They assume discomfort means something is wrong. They retreat. The system records this retreat as confirmation that deviation was unsafe. Identity strengthens. This is the exact loop that traps people. Attempting to override this mechanism with force escalates the conflict. Willpower temporarily suppresses the signal, but suppression does not remove the underlying prediction. The moment force is removed, the system reasserts control. This is why identity change cannot be forced. It must be persuaded. Persuasion does not occur through reasoning. It occurs through evidence. Identity updates only when the system detects a pattern that is more reliable than the existing one. This requires repetition without overwhelming stress. When emotional load is too high, the system interprets the behavior as an anomaly. It does not integrate it. When emotional load is low enough to tolerate but high enough to register, the behavior becomes informative. This is the narrow window where identity can change. High performers operate almost exclusively in this window. They do not rely on extreme effort. They rely on consistent exposure to manageable discomfort. Over time, what was once threatening becomes normal. This is not mindset, it is desensitization through repetition. Identity is also social. The brain tracks how behavior is received by the environment. Approval, indifference, and rejection all carry weight. This is why changing behavior can feel socially risky even in isolation. The system anticipates judgment based on past experience. This anticipation influences action even when no one is watching. The audience is internalized. To change identity, the system must observe you acting differently and surviving, not once. Repeatedly, survival is the metric. Survival includes emotional survivability, not just physical. If you act differently and the experience is overwhelming, the system learns the wrong lesson. If you act differently and remain regulated, the system updates its expectation. This is why dramatic life changes often fail. They demand too much deviation too quickly. The system responds with full defensive activation. Reversion becomes inevitable. Gradual change works because it keeps the system calm enough to learn. Identity is not changed by declaration, saying, "I am the kind of person who," does nothing unless followed by evidence. The system does not accept testimony. It accepts observation. It watches what you do when tired, what you do when no one is enforcing consequences, what you do when the outcome is uncertain. These moments carry disproportionate weight. Identity is what remains when incentives are removed. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Intensity is visible. Consistency is diagnostic. Identity is built from what is predictable, not what is impressive. Once identity begins to shift, resistance changes character. It becomes quieter, less dramatic, less emotional. Eventually, it disappears not because you overcame it, but because it is no longer needed. The system no longer predicts threat. This is the real marker of identity change. Not confidence, not excitement, absence of friction. You will not feel like a new person. You will feel like this is simply what you do now. In the next chapter, you will see why motivation spikes feel powerful, but are structurally incapable of producing this shift, and why relying on them guarantees oscillation rather than transformation. Chapter 5. Why motivation creates oscillation, not change. Motivation feels like power. That is precisely why it is misleading. Motivation is not a control system. It is a transient physiological state. It emerges when novelty, hope, urgency, or emotional contrast temporarily elevate dopamine and norepinephrine. These chemicals increase focus, energy, and willingness to tolerate discomfort. This spike is real. Its interpretation is wrong. Most people mistake motivation for capacity. They assume that because they feel capable now, they are capable in general. They design plans that depend on this elevated state persisting. When it inevitably fades, they interpret the collapse as personal failure. In reality, the failure occurred at the design level. Motivation is, by definition, unstable. If it were stable, it would not be motivation. It would be identity. The nervous system does not maintain elevated arousal without a reason. High energy states are metabolically expensive. They evolved to solve immediate problems, not to sustain long-term behavior. Once the perceived novelty or threat disappears, the system downregulates automatically. This downregulation is not optional. It is regulatory. Motivation spikes are followed by motivational debt. After a period of forced output, the system seeks compensation. Fatigue increases, disinterest appears, avoidance becomes attractive. This is not laziness, it is homeostasis. This is why motivation-based change produces oscillation. You surge forward, you exhaust the system, you crash, you recover, you repeat. Each cycle feels dramatic. Each cycle reinforces the same conclusion. I can do this sometimes, but not consistently. That conclusion is identity shaping. Over time, the system compresses this pattern into a belief. Consistency is not who I am. Motivation becomes the only acceptable entry point for action. When motivation is absent, inaction feels justified. This is not a conscious choice. It is conditioning. Motivation trains you to associate action with a specific emotional prerequisite. You learn implicitly that effort requires feeling ready. The absence of readiness becomes a stop signal. High performers do not use motivation as a prerequisite. They treat it as a byproduct. This is a critical inversion. Motivation-based systems ask, how do I generate the feeling so I can act? Identity-based systems ask what action executes regardless of feeling. The first creates volatility. The second creates stability. Motivation also distorts feedback. When you act under high motivation, the emotional state itself becomes the most salient feature of the experience. The brain records not just what you did, but how you felt while doing it. This creates a dangerous association. Progress feels good only when motivation is high. When you later act without that emotional intensity, the contrast feels like something is wrong. Neutral execution is misinterpreted as lack of commitment. Boredom is misread as misalignment. In reality, boredom is often the signal that behavior is becoming normalized. Motivation addicts you to intensity. Identity requires neutrality. This is why people abandon systems that start working. As soon as execution becomes routine, it loses emotional charge. Without charge, it feels meaningless. The person seeks a new spike instead of allowing the identity to consolidate. They are chasing the feeling of change, not the structure of change. Motivation also encourages overcommitment. In a motivated state, the system underestimates future cost. You plan as if energy, focus, and discipline will remain elevated indefinitely. This leads to schedules and standards that cannot be maintained under normal conditions. When normal conditions return, the plan collapses. The lesson the brain learns is not the plan was unrealistic. The lesson it learns is, I fail when I try. This lesson strengthens identity-level avoidance. Motivation, therefore, has a paradoxical effect. It increases short-term output while sabotaging long-term belief change. It produces evidence of intensity, not evidence of reliability. Identity does not update from intensity. It updates from predictability. Another failure mode of motivation is emotional dependency. When progress is driven by feeling, setbacks become emotionally amplified. A missed day feels catastrophic. A lapse feels like regression. This emotional volatility increases stress and accelerates abandonment. Stable systems absorb failure without drama. Motivated systems collapse under it. High performers design systems that work on low energy days. They assume motivation will be absent more often than present. This assumption makes their systems robust. They do not ask, can I do this when I'm inspired? They ask, will this still execute when I'm indifferent? That question determines whether a behavior integrates into identity. Motivation also creates a false sense of agency. When you act only when motivated, you attribute success to internal states you do not control. This weakens self-trust. You begin to see yourself as dependent on moods rather than processes. Identity-based action restores agency by removing emotional negotiation. You act because this is what happens next, not because you feel like it. This distinction matters under stress. Stress suppresses motivation. If your system depends on motivation, stress will shut it down. If your system depends on identity, stress will default to it. Under pressure, you do not rise to your goals. You fall to your conditioning. This is why elite performers look consistent in chaotic environments. They are not calmer, they are more automated. The nervous system prefers automation because it reduces decision cost. Motivation requires constant reevaluation. Identity executes without discussion. To change sustainably, you must stop asking how to feel more motivated and start asking how to make action independent of feeling. This does not mean ignoring emotion. It means refusing to let emotion dictate execution. Motivation is a signal, not a strategy. Used correctly, it can initiate a system. Used incorrectly, it becomes the system. If you build around it, oscillation is guaranteed. In the next chapter, you will see why action, not intention, insight, or desire, is the only interface that updates reality, and why behavior must come before belief for any identity change to occur. Chapter 6. Action is the only interface with reality. Most people believe thinking is the primary lever of change. They assume that if understanding is deep enough, behavior will follow. This assumption is false. Thought does not directly modify reality. Action does. The nervous system knows this. It therefore assigns higher credibility to what you do than to what you think, say, or intend. From the brain's perspective, action is commitment. Thought is simulation. You can simulate infinitely without consequence. Action carries cost. Cost signals seriousness. The system updates based on cost-bearing behavior, not internal narration. This is why insight rarely produces change. Insight feels significant because it reorganizes concepts. The emotional response to insight creates the illusion of progress. But unless insight is followed by repeated action, the system records no new evidence. Nothing in the external world changes. The internal model remains intact. Action is the only event that creates feedback. Feedback is the raw material for learning. Without feedback, there is no update. This is why reading, planning, and reflecting feel productive while producing no durable results. They create cognitive activity without environmental response. The loop is incomplete. Action closes the loop. When you act, the environment responds. That response is processed emotionally. The emotional outcome is stored as memory. Memory updates belief. Belief adjusts identity. Identity biases future action. Remove action, and the loop collapses. This is why identity change cannot begin with belief. Belief is downstream of experience. Experience requires behavior. Behavior requires execution regardless of belief. This ordering is non-negotiable. Many people attempt to reverse it. They wait to feel confident before acting. They wait to believe before committing. They wait to feel ready before starting. The system interprets this waiting as avoidance. Avoidance generates evidence. That evidence reinforces the belief that action is unsafe or excessive. Inaction is not neutral. It is instructive. Every time you hesitate, the system learns something. Every time you postpone, the system updates its model. The lesson is always the same. This behavior is optional. Optional behaviors never integrate into identity. High performers do not ask whether to act. They have already answered that question structurally. The only remaining variable is how. This is a crucial distinction. When the decision to act is pre-resolved, execution consumes minimal energy. When the decision must be renegotiated, energy is drained before action even begins. Most people experience exhaustion before they start. They attribute it to lack of motivation. In reality, they are exhausted by indecision. Action reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty is metabolically expensive. The brain prefers definitive movement over prolonged evaluation. Once action begins, anxiety often decreases. This is not because the action is easy, but because the system has exited ambiguity. This is why starting is often the hardest part, not because the task is difficult, but because the system is transitioning from simulation to commitment. Action also creates constraint. Once you act, you are no longer imagining infinite possibilities. You are dealing with concrete outcomes. This constraint is uncomfortable for people attached to potential rather than reality. Potential feels safe because it is untested. Action risks exposing limits. Identity resists this exposure. This is another reason action precedes belief. Belief protects the current model. Action challenges it. When you act consistently in a new direction, the system is forced to reconcile prediction with outcome. If you survive the action and the consequences are tolerable, the prediction must update. This update does not require success. It requires survival. The system is not asking, "Did this go perfectly?" It is asking, "Did we die?" If the answer is no, the behavior becomes less threatening. This is why imperfect action is sufficient. Execution does not need to be optimal to be informative. It needs to be repeated. Perfectionism blocks action because it raises the perceived cost. High perceived cost triggers defensive inhibition. The system freezes. High performers do not seek perfect execution. They seek consistent exposure. Action also clarifies identity boundaries. You learn what actually matters to you, not by introspection, but by observing what you do under constraint. Values are revealed through behavior, not declared through language. This is uncomfortable. It removes plausible deniability. Once you act, you cannot pretend anymore. This is why people avoid action while claiming desire. The nervous system prefers coherent narratives. Action forces coherence. When behavior contradicts self-concept, discomfort arises. This discomfort is often labeled as shame or guilt. In reality, it is the system detecting inconsistency. This inconsistency is not a problem. It is the point. Repeated action resolves inconsistency by forcing identity to adjust. Either behavior reverts or identity updates. There is no third option. Willpower attempts to force behavior without allowing identity to update. This creates chronic inconsistency and chronic discomfort. Action-based conditioning allows identity to follow behavior. Discomfort appears initially, then fades as alignment increases. This fading is not emotional numbness. It is normalization. Once behavior becomes normal, belief changes quietly. You stop thinking of yourself as someone who is trying. You start thinking of yourself as someone who does. Language shifts last. Identity shifts first. This is why tracking action is more important than tracking mood. Mood is volatile. Action is diagnostic. If you want to change who you are, you must change what you repeatedly do, not how you repeatedly think. There is no other interface. In the next chapter, you will see how repeated action becomes belief through the evidence loop and why emotional weight determines whether behavior integrates or remains an anomaly. Chapter 7. The Evidence Loop. How belief is manufactured. The brain does not seek truth, it seeks predictability. Every system inside you is organized around one priority, reducing uncertainty about what will happen next. Certainty is metabolically efficient. Surprise is expensive. Belief exists to eliminate surprise. This is why belief is not philosophical, it is operational. A belief is simply a prediction the brain no longer questions. The mechanism that creates this prediction is what we will call the evidence loop. It runs continuously, automatically, and without moral judgment. You are inside it whether you participate consciously or not. The loop has 5 stages: action, outcome, emotional weight, memory bias, future prediction. Miss one stage, and the loop weakens. Control all 5, and belief becomes programmable. Let's break this down precisely. Action is the entry point. Nothing enters the loop without behavior. Thoughts do not qualify. Intentions do not qualify. Self-concepts do not qualify. Only what you physically or behaviorally do generates data. This is why people can spend years working on themselves without changing. They are generating no behavioral input. The system has nothing to process. Outcome follows action. Outcomes do not need to be positive to be informative. They need to be consistent. The brain does not care if something went well. It cares if it went as expected. Consistency builds expectation. Expectation builds belief. Emotional weight determines whether the outcome is stored. The brain is flooded with information constantly. It cannot store everything. Emotion acts as a filter. Events that carry emotional charge are prioritized. This is where most self-sabotage occurs. Negative outcomes are often paired with intense emotion, frustration, shame, disappointment. Positive outcomes are often emotionally muted or dismissed. The system, therefore, records more evidence for failure than for success, even when success is more frequent. This imbalance is not reality-based. It is emotion-based. Memory bias is the next stage. Memory is not a recording, it is a reconstruction. Each time a memory is recalled, it is rewritten with current emotional context. This means beliefs are not just built from what happened, but from how often and how emotionally you revisit what happened. Rumination is belief reinforcement. Finally, future prediction emerges. The brain asks a simple question: what usually happens when I do this? The answer is not analytical, it is felt. That feeling becomes belief. Once belief stabilizes, the loop accelerates. Belief biases perception. Perception biases action. Action produces outcomes that confirm belief. The system becomes self-sealing. This is why beliefs feel obvious. They are no longer conclusions. They are filters. Most people try to break this loop at the wrong point. They argue with the prediction. They attempt to override feeling with logic. This fails because logic does not modify memory, and memory is what prediction is built from. You cannot reason a system out of a pattern it learned through experience. High performers understand this implicitly. They do not ask, "How do I believe differently?" They ask, "What evidence am I feeding the system daily?" They treat belief as a downstream artifact, not a starting point. This is why acting before believing is not reckless. It is the only sequence that works. However, not all action produces usable evidence. This is where most people unknowingly sabotage themselves. If the action is too small, it carries no emotional weight. The system ignores it. If the action is too large, it triggers threat responses. The system labels it as an anomaly. In both cases, identity does not update. For evidence to compress into belief, the action must sit inside a narrow band, uncomfortable enough to register, safe enough to repeat. This is not about courage. It is about dosage. High performers are precise about dosage. They design actions that they can repeat under normal conditions, not ideal ones. They optimize for absorption, not intensity. This is why extreme challenges rarely change identity. They are memorable, but they are not predictive. The brain categorizes them as exceptions. Identity updates only from what appears normal. Another critical variable in the evidence loop is frequency. The brain weights recent evidence more heavily than distant evidence. This is why daily behavior matters more than sporadic excellence. Your identity is not built from your best moments. It is built from your most recent pattern. This is also why relapse feels so powerful. A short period of emotionally charged avoidance can outweigh months of progress if mishandled. The system updates rapidly when it senses instability. High performers neutralize this by controlling emotional interpretation. A missed action is logged as data, not identity commentary. No meaning is attached. The loop remains intact. Low performers attach narrative. Narrative amplifies emotion. Emotion distorts memory. Memory reshapes belief. This is not a mindset issue. It is a feedback engineering issue. The evidence loop also explains why confidence cannot be manufactured. Confidence is simply the subjective feeling of predictability. It emerges only after the system has enough data. Waiting for confidence before acting is equivalent to waiting for the loop to complete itself without input. It cannot. Confidence is evidence felt in advance. Without evidence, the feeling is unstable and collapses under stress. This is why people feel confident after planning, but lose it during execution. Planning simulates certainty. Action tests it. Only tested certainty survives. High performers build confidence accidentally by flooding the loop with consistent evidence. They stop checking how they feel. They check whether the input was delivered. Over time, belief shifts quietly. Resistance decreases. Hesitation shortens. Execution feels less dramatic. There is no moment of realization. There is only a moment where action happens without discussion. That is belief change. If you want to know what you truly believe, do not ask yourself. Observe what you do when effort is required and no one is watching. The evidence loop never lies. In the next chapter, you will see why certainty always comes after execution, why waiting to feel ready is a logical error, and how high performers act in the absence of belief without creating internal conflict. Chapter 8. Acting before believing is not optional. The belief that you must feel ready before acting is one of the most damaging assumptions in modern self-improvement. It feels reasonable. It is mechanically incorrect. Readiness is not a prerequisite for action. It is a byproduct of repeated exposure. The nervous system does not grant certainty in advance. It grants certainty after prediction becomes reliable. This ordering matters. Violate it and progress stalls indefinitely. Most people wait for belief because belief feels like safety. Acting without belief feels reckless, unstable, and irresponsible. From the system's perspective, it is unsafe because it violates existing predictions. That discomfort is not a warning, it is evidence. The brain is signaling that the behavior has not yet been normalized. That signal is precisely what must be crossed for belief to update. Waiting for belief before acting guarantees that belief never changes. The system cannot update predictions without data. Data requires action. Action requires acting under uncertainty. This is not philosophy, it is system design. The nervous system evolved to update beliefs after surviving new behavior, not before. Belief is the record of survival, not a promise of safety. This is why children learn rapidly. They act without conceptual belief. They touch, fall, fail, and recover. The system updates based on experience, not analysis. Adults reverse this order and then wonder why learning slows. The demand for certainty before action is a defense mechanism. It protects the existing identity by preventing exposure to contradictory evidence. It disguises avoidance as prudence. The language sounds responsible. I just want to be sure. The function is conservative. Do not let identity change. High performers understand this intuitively. They do not ask whether they believe they can do something. They ask whether the action is survivable. Survivability is the only relevant criterion. If you can act and remain regulated, physically and emotionally, the system can learn. If you wait for confidence, the system never gets the chance. This is why the first repetitions of any new behavior feel unstable. The brain has no prediction model yet. Uncertainty is experienced as anxiety. Anxiety here is not fear of failure. It is fear of unpredictability. Most people interpret this anxiety as a signal to stop. High performers interpret it as a signal that learning is occurring. This interpretation difference compounds over time. Acting before believing also feels inauthentic to many people. They believe that action should reflect internal truth. Acting without belief feels dishonest. This is another misunderstanding. Belief is not internal truth. It is internal habit. Acting differently is not lying. It is providing the system with new data. Authenticity is not alignment with current belief. It is alignment with chosen inputs. The idea that you must Feel like the person before acting like them is backwards. Feeling follows behavior, not the other way around. Every identity you currently inhabit was learned through action before belief. You did not first believe you were capable of walking, speaking, or functioning socially. You acted clumsily until belief formed. The same mechanism applies now. The system does not care that you are older. It operates the same way. The reason acting before believing feels harder as an adult is not because the mechanism changed. It is because identity has more mass. More evidence must be displaced. This requires patience, not force. Acting before believing does not mean acting recklessly or dramatically. It means acting minimally but consistently without requiring emotional permission. The action must be small enough to survive, large enough to register. If the action is too large, the system categorizes it as exceptional and does not integrate it. If it is too small, it carries no informational value. The correct size produces discomfort without panic. This discomfort is not a problem to solve. It is the learning signal. Most people attempt to remove this discomfort through reassurance, affirmations, or analysis. This reduces emotional load and weakens memory formation. The system learns nothing. High performers do the opposite. They allow discomfort to exist without interpretation. They do not escalate it. They do not narrate it. They execute anyway. Over time, the discomfort decreases not because they became braver, but because the system updated its prediction. Once prediction updates, belief changes. Once belief changes, action no longer feels like acting before believing. It simply feels like acting. This transition is quiet. There is no moment of arrival. One day, you notice that the question, "Can I do this?" no longer appears. The action executes without discussion. That is belief formation. This is also why relapse occurs when acting before believing is misunderstood. If you act dramatically once, then retreat. The system learns the opposite lesson. This behavior is unsustainable. Consistency matters more than courage. Acting before believing must be done repeatedly, under tolerable conditions. That is the only way belief stabilizes. You do not need to convince yourself. You need to survive the behavior enough times that conviction becomes unnecessary. In the next chapter, you will see how perception itself is shaped by identity, why high performers see different options in the same environment, and how selective attention determines what actions even enter consideration. Chapter 9. Perceptual Filters. Decide what feels possible. You do not experience reality directly. You experience a filtered version of it. This is not a metaphor. It is a constraint. At any moment, your nervous system is receiving far more sensory, cognitive, and emotional input than it can process. To function, it must discard most of it. What remains becomes your subjective experience of reality. These filters are not neutral. They are shaped by identity. Identity determines what your brain considers relevant, threatening, feasible, or worth ignoring. Before you consciously evaluate a situation, the filtering has already occurred. By the time you decide, the decision space has been narrowed. This is why two people can face the same environment and see completely different options. One sees opportunity, the other sees risk. Neither is choosing consciously. Perceptual filters are learned through the same evidence loop described earlier. Repeated actions produce outcomes. Outcomes are emotionally tagged. Emotion biases memory. Memory shapes prediction. Prediction informs attention. Attention then selects reality. This selection happens automatically. If your history teaches the system that effort leads to disappointment, attention will gravitate toward signs of futility. If your history teaches the system that persistence leads to progress, attention will gravitate toward leverage. The world did not change. The filter did. Most people believe their limitations come from external constraints, lack of time, resources, intelligence, or luck. In reality, most limitations never enter consideration. They are filtered out before conscious awareness. You cannot pursue an option you cannot perceive. This is why advice rarely works. Advice assumes shared perception. It assumes the same option set is visible to everyone. It is not. Telling someone to take initiative is meaningless if initiative does not appear as a viable move inside their perceptual frame. The instruction never reaches execution. High performers are not more optimistic. They are differently filtered. Their nervous systems are conditioned to notice leverage instead of threat, process instead of outcome, next step instead of final result. This is not mindset. It is attentional bias reinforced through experience. Perceptual filters also determine what feels heavy or light. The same task can feel overwhelming or trivial depending on identity alignment. This has nothing to do with task difficulty. It has everything to do with prediction. If the system predicts failure or exhaustion, the task feels heavy before it begins. If the system predicts survivability, the same task feels manageable. This is why procrastination often feels rational. The filter presents the task as disproportionately costly. Avoidance feels intelligent. The person is not lazy. They are acting on filtered information. Fear plays a specific role here. Fear is not just an emotion. It is a prioritization signal. It tells the system what to monitor closely. When fear is dominant, attention narrows. The system focuses on immediate threats and short-term relief. Long-term benefits are filtered out. This is adaptive in danger. It is destructive in growth. High performers do not eliminate fear. They change what fear is attached to. Through repeated exposure, fear becomes associated with inaction rather than action. Discomfort shifts from execution to avoidance. This reverses the attentional bias. The system begins to highlight opportunities to act because not acting produces internal friction. This is not conscious reframing, it is conditioning. Another critical filter is social expectation. The brain constantly predicts how behavior will be received. Even in solitude, these predictions influence perception. Options that threaten social identity are filtered as dangerous. This is why change often feels socially risky, even when no one is watching. Performers expand their perceptual range by repeatedly acting outside expected roles and surviving the social consequences. Over time, the system learns that deviation is tolerable. The filter widens. Perception is also shaped by effort history. If effort has historically led to minimal payoff, the system learns to ignore effort-based solutions. Shortcuts become more visible than process. This is why some people instinctively look for hacks, while others default to repetition. Neither is a personality trait. It is learned attention. Changing perceptual filters requires new evidence, not new beliefs. You cannot will yourself to see opportunity if your system has learned to expect punishment. You must provide repeated experiences where acting differently does not result in catastrophe. This is why small survivable actions matter. They do not just change behavior, they recalibrate perception. Over time, the decision space changes. More options appear. Fewer feel threatening. Execution accelerates not because you are trying harder, but because fewer internal objections are generated. This is the hidden advantage of identity-based change. As perception shifts, effort decreases. What once required discipline becomes obvious. What once required courage becomes routine. This is also why regression can feel sudden. Under stress, perceptual filters tighten. The system defaults to older predictions. Options disappear. Avoidance feels reasonable again. This is not failure, it is reversion to the strongest filter under load. High performers anticipate this. They do not panic when perception narrows. They rely on pre-decided inputs rather than momentary evaluation. They act even when options feel limited. Over time, the baseline filter strengthens. Stress has less effect. The system learns that execution is safe even under pressure. Eventually, the perceptual filter stabilizes at a higher level of tolerance. This is when people say someone has changed. In reality, they are seeing the same world through a different filter. In the next chapter, you will see why fear is not an obstacle, but a navigation signal, how identity boundaries are revealed through discomfort, and how to use resistance as directional data instead of something to overcome. Chapter 10. Fear is a navigation signal, not an obstacle. Fear is widely misunderstood. Most people treat fear as an enemy to eliminate, suppress, or overcome. They assume that progress requires fearlessness. This assumption guarantees stagnation. Fear is not a flaw in the system. It is a diagnostic output. Fear appears when identity boundaries are approached. It marks the edge of what the nervous system currently predicts as safe, familiar, and survivable. In that sense, fear is not blocking progress. It is pointing directly at it. The problem is not fear. The problem is interpretation. When fear arises, most people assume it means do not proceed. This interpretation trains avoidance. Avoidance produces relief. Relief is emotionally reinforcing. The system learns that fear successfully prevented danger. Identity tightens. Over time, the boundary hardens. Fear begins to appear earlier and more intensely. What once felt mildly uncomfortable becomes intolerable. The navigational signal is mistaken for a stop sign. High performers interpret fear differently. They read it as this behavior is not yet normalized. That interpretation changes everything. Fear, in this frame, is not evidence of risk. It is evidence of novelty. The nervous system does not distinguish between harmful novelty and beneficial novelty at first. It flags both the same way. Only repeated exposure allows discrimination. This is why fear cannot be reasoned away. It is not a cognitive assessment. It is a prediction error signal. Trying to calm fear through reassurance without changing behavior teaches the system nothing. The prediction remains intact. Fear will return next time. Only exposure updates prediction. This does not mean reckless exposure. It means controlled, survivable contact with what fear is signaling. Fear spikes when identity detects potential loss of coherence. Acting differently threatens the model of who you are. From the system's perspective, that model is keeping you alive. Challenging it feels dangerous even when the external risk is minimal. This is why fear often feels disproportionate. The system is protecting structure, not evaluating outcomes. Fear is strongest when the action threatens self-concept, not safety. Public visibility, commitment, responsibility, and consistency all provoke fear because they reduce escape routes. They increase predictability. Predictability locks identity in place. The old identity resists. This resistance is experienced as anxiety, hesitation, or urge to delay. Most people respond by negotiating internally. They argue with fear, analyze it, seek reassurance, or wait for it to subside. This delays action and reinforces the signal. High performers do not negotiate. They treat fear as information, not authority. The rule is simple. If the action is survivable and aligned with chosen inputs, fear is irrelevant. This removes emotional debate from execution. Fear also has a timing signature. It appears before action, not during sustained execution. Once behavior begins, fear often decreases. This is because uncertainty collapses once commitment is made. The system prefers known discomfort over unknown risk. This is why starting is often harder than continuing. Fear also clusters. One avoided action strengthens fear around adjacent actions. the boundary expands. Over time, the system becomes conservative across domains. Conversely, one repeatedly crossed boundary weakens fear nearby. Courage is not generalized through belief. It is generalized through exposure. High performers build tolerance systematically. They do not try to eliminate fear globally. They expand the boundary incrementally. They choose actions that trigger manageable fear and repeat them until fear subsides. Then they move outward. This process feels slow. It is also permanent. Another critical misunderstanding is the belief that fear must disappear before progress is real. In reality, fear disappearing too quickly is a sign that the action is no longer informative. Fear is useful until the behavior integrates. After that, it fades because it is no longer needed. The goal is not fearlessness. The goal is accurate fear. Accurate fear appears only in genuinely dangerous situations. Inaccurate fear appears at identity edges. The only way to correct it is through repeated evidence of survival. Avoidance preserves inaccurate fear indefinitely. This is why people can fear harmless situations for decades. The system has never received contradictory data. Fear also interacts with meaning. When fear is interpreted as weakness, shame amplifies it. When fear is interpreted as direction, it loses authority. High performers do not feel less fear initially. They feel less confused by it. They know what it means. They know that fear is the cost of identity expansion. It is the toll you pay at the boundary. Once paid enough times, the road becomes normal. The mistake most people make is trying to pay the toll once with intensity. They attempt dramatic exposure, overwhelm the system, and retreat. The lesson learned is this was dangerous. Small, repeated payments change the map. Fear must be encountered under conditions of control, repetition, and regulation. Panic teaches avoidance. Tolerable discomfort teaches adaptation. This is why motivation-driven fear confrontations fail. Motivation pushes too hard, too fast. Identity responds by slamming the brakes. Identity-based exposure respects the system's learning rate. Over time, something subtle changes. Fear no longer dominates attention. It becomes background noise. The decision to act no longer requires emotional resolution. At that point, fear has done its job. It pointed you toward the boundary. You crossed it enough times. The boundary moved. In the next chapter, you will see why controlling inputs matters more than chasing outcomes, how outcome obsession creates paralysis, and how high performers design execution that remains stable regardless of results. Chapter 11. Input control is the only thing you actually control. Most people believe they are working toward outcomes. In reality, they are reacting to them. Outcomes are seductive because they feel definitive. They offer clarity, success or failure, progress or stagnation, winning or losing. This clarity is comforting. It is also misleading. Outcomes are lagging indicators. By the time an outcome appears, the behavior that produced it has already been repeated many times. Focusing on outcomes is focusing on the past. The nervous system does not respond well to delayed feedback. It evolved in environments where cause and effect were closely linked. Modern goals break that link. Months of effort may produce no visible outcome. The system struggles to associate behavior with reward. This gap creates anxiety. To compensate, people monitor outcomes obsessively. They check metrics, results, comparisons, and benchmarks. Each check produces emotional feedback. That feedback influences future behavior. This is where most self-sabotage occurs. When outcomes are positive, effort feels justified. When outcomes are negative or absent, effort feels foolish. Execution becomes conditional on external validation. Conditional execution is unstable by design. The system learns a dangerous rule. Only act when results are visible. When results lag, as they inevitably do, action stops. The evidence loop is starved. Identity stagnates. High performers avoid this trap by shifting control upstream. They do not ask, "Am I winning?" They ask, "Did I deliver the input?" Inputs are actions you can execute regardless of outcome. They are fully controllable. They occur in the present. They produce data immediately. This is not semantics, it is architecture. When behavior is tied to inputs, execution becomes independent of emotional feedback. The system no longer needs reassurance from results. It only needs completion. This dramatically reduces cognitive load. Input control also collapses uncertainty. Instead of evaluating infinite variables, the system evaluates one binary question. Was the input delivered? Yes or no. Binary systems are efficient. Ambiguous systems drain energy. Most people design their lives around ambiguous standards. Work harder, be more consistent, try your best. These standards are unmeasurable. They invite constant self-evaluation. Self-evaluation amplifies emotion. Emotion destabilizes execution. High performers design non-negotiable inputs with clear volume and cadence. Not write more, but write 500 words before noon. Not train consistently, but train 4 days per week, regardless of intensity. These inputs are boring. That is their strength. Boredom signals low emotional volatility. Low volatility allows repetition. Repetition generates evidence. Evidence updates identity. Outcome obsession reverses this sequence. It creates emotional spikes tied to variables you do not control. This increases volatility and reduces repetition. Another failure mode of outcome focus is premature optimization. People adjust strategy based on short-term results. They interpret noise as signal. This creates constant system changes. Systems that change too often cannot compound. High performers commit to inputs long enough for signal to emerge. They tolerate ambiguity. They resist the urge to react. This patience is not personality, it is structural. Input-based systems also neutralize fear of failure. If success is defined as input completion, failure loses its power. You cannot fail today if you delivered the input. This does not eliminate ambition, it stabilizes it. Ambition without stability produces burnout. Stability without ambition produces stagnation. Input control allows ambition to persist without volatility. This is why outcome-based motivation collapses under stress. Stress introduces variability. Outcomes fluctuate. Motivation follows. Execution suffers. Input-based execution survives stress because the criteria do not change. You may execute poorly, you may execute tired, you may execute imperfectly, but you execute. Identity does not care about quality at first. It cares about predictability. Once predictability is established, quality improves automatically. Skill compounds on consistency, not intensity. Another overlooked benefit of input control is trust. When you repeatedly deliver inputs, the system learns something critical. This organism does what it says it will do. That belief changes everything. Self-trust is not built through promises or reflection. It is built through observable follow-through. Inputs provide that observation daily. Outcome-based systems erode self-trust because outcomes fluctuate regardless of effort. The system cannot distinguish bad luck from bad execution. Doubt increases. High performers avoid tying identity to outcomes they cannot control. They tie identity to behavior they can repeat. This is why they appear calm in uncertain environments. Their sense of agency is not dependent on results. It is anchored in execution. Input control also simplifies decision-making. When inputs are predefined, the system does not waste energy evaluating options. There is nothing to decide. The input either happens or it does not. Decision fatigue disappears. Most people exhaust themselves deciding whether to act. High performers reserve energy for how to act. This difference compounds daily. Over time, input control creates inevitability. When inputs are delivered at sufficient volume over sufficient time, outcomes collapse statistically, not because of belief, but because probability runs out of alternatives. You do not need to believe you will succeed. You need to deliver inputs long enough that failure becomes unlikely. This is engineering, not optimism. In the next chapter, you will see how high performers design non-negotiable actions, remove choice from execution, and build systems that function even when motivation, confidence, and clarity are absent. Chapter 12. Removing choice from execution. Most people believe freedom is the ability to choose. In practice, choice is the primary source of failure. Every time you allow a behavior to be decided in the moment, you expose it to emotional interference. Mood, fatigue, stress, distraction, and context all gain veto power. Execution becomes conditional. Conditional systems do not compound. The nervous system is not designed to make repeated, high-quality decisions. Decision-making is expensive. Each choice consumes attention and increases cognitive load. Over time, the system seeks relief by avoiding decisions altogether. This is why people feel exhausted before they act. The fatigue is not from work. It is from deliberation. High performers remove choice wherever consistency matters. They do not ask whether to act. They ask only how execution will occur. The decision has already been made structurally, outside the moment of action. This is the difference between intention and commitment. Intentions exist in the future. Commitments exist in the environment. A non-negotiable action is not something you want to do. It is something that will happen unless physically prevented. It does not rely on internal agreement. This is uncomfortable for people who equate autonomy with constant self-consultation. In reality, constant consultation weakens autonomy by making behavior hostage to internal states. Identity-based execution requires the opposite move, pre-commitment. Pre-commitment shifts decision-making from an emotionally volatile state to a neutral one. You decide once, calmly, then execute many times automatically. This is how habits form, but habits alone are insufficient. Habits describe repetition, not constraint. Constraint is what removes choice. Constraint can be temporal, spatial, social, or structural. Temporal, action happens at a fixed time. Spatial, action happens in a fixed location. Social, action is visible or accountable. Structural, action is embedded in a system that makes avoidance costly. High performers stack constraints deliberately, not to punish themselves but to protect execution from emotion. Most people do the opposite. They preserve maximum flexibility and then wonder why consistency fails. Flexibility feels kind. It is also destabilizing. When everything is optional, nothing integrates. Non-negotiable does not mean extreme. It means binary. Either the input occurred or it did not. There is no interpretation, no grading, no emotional analysis. Binary systems are stable. Graded systems invite rationalization. This is why do your best fails. It allows reinterpretation after the fact. The system learns nothing. Clear rules create clear evidence. Another critical aspect of removing choice is reducing scope. People often design actions that require multiple decisions inside execution. This reintroduces friction. For example, work on the project is vague. It contains dozens of micro-decisions. Each one is an exit point. High performers define actions narrowly. Open the document and write for 25 minutes. Execution begins immediately. Momentum follows. Momentum is not motivation, it is reduced resistance. Choice removal also changes how the system interprets failure. When an action is optional, skipping it feels justified. When it is non-negotiable, skipping it creates dissonance. That dissonance is informative. The goal is not to never miss. The goal is to make missing noticeable without dramatization. Data, not shame. Shame reintroduces emotion. Emotion destabilizes repetition. High performers treat missed execution as a system error, not a character flaw. They adjust constraints, not self-talk. This is why they improve systems instead of blaming themselves. Another overlooked benefit of removing choice is speed. When execution is predetermined, action begins faster. The gap between intention and behavior collapses. This gap is where most people lose momentum. Speed also reduces fear. Fear thrives in anticipation. Immediate execution short-circuits anticipation. Once the action begins, uncertainty collapses. This is why rituals matter. A ritual is a sequence that initiates behavior without decision. It bypasses evaluation entirely. High performers rely on rituals, not motivation. They do not wake up and assess how they feel. They follow a sequence. Feeling is irrelevant. This does not mean ignoring internal state forever. It means not allowing it to veto execution. Over time, the nervous system learns a new rule. This action happens regardless of mood. That rule is identity changing. Identity is built from what is reliable. Removing choice also clarifies priorities. When actions are non-negotiable, everything else organizes around them. Time expands around commitment. When actions are optional, they are crowded out by urgency. Urgency always defeats importance unless importance is structurally protected. This is why people say they value things they rarely do. Values without structure are aspirations, not drivers. Structure turns values into behavior. Eventually, something shifts. The action no longer feels forced. It feels expected. Resistance decreases. Execution becomes automatic. At that point, choice is no longer needed. The system has integrated the behavior. This is not rigidity. It is efficiency. Freedom is not the ability to choose endlessly. Freedom is the ability to execute without negotiation. In the next chapter, you will see how repetition converts non-negotiable action into certainty, why confidence is a statistical artifact, and how identity stabilizes once behavior becomes predictable. Chapter 13. Certainty is a statistical side effect. Most people treat certainty as a prerequisite. High performers treat it as exhaust. This single inversion explains most performance gaps. Certainty is not something you generate internally. It is not a mindset, a belief choice, or an act of confidence. Certainty is what the nervous system feels after it has seen enough consistent evidence to stop questioning prediction. In other words, certainty is what remains when doubt is no longer useful. The brain does not seek confidence. It seeks reliability. Confidence is the subjective sensation that reliability has been established. This is why confidence always arrives late. People who wait to feel certain before acting are waiting for an output before supplying the input. The system cannot comply. No evidence has been generated. Prediction remains unstable. Doubt persists. Doubt is not a flaw. It is the correct response to insufficient data. High performers do not interpret doubt as a stop signal. They interpret it as a measurement. The sample size is still too small. This framing removes emotion from the experience. Doubt becomes informational, not personal. Certainty emerges when variability decreases. When the system observes the same behavior occurring under different internal states, tired, bored, stressed, indifferent, it concludes that the behavior is reliable. Reliability collapses uncertainty. Uncertainty collapsing feels like confidence. This is why repetition matters more than success. A single success proves nothing. 100 survivable repetitions prove everything. The nervous system does not count victories, it counts predictability. Most people attempt to shortcut this process through affirmation, visualization, or emotional hype. These techniques may produce temporary arousal, but they do not reduce variability. Under stress, the system reverts to its last reliable pattern. This is why confidence gained through emotion evaporates under pressure. Certainty gained through repetition does not. Another misunderstanding is the belief that certainty must be complete. People assume that high performers feel unwavering confidence. They do not. They feel sufficient certainty to act. This threshold is much lower than people expect. The system does not need absolute assurance. It needs a probability distribution that favors execution over avoidance. Once that threshold is crossed, behavior initiates automatically. This is why high performers still feel fear and doubt. Those signals simply no longer dominate decision-making. Certainty does not eliminate emotion, it deprioritizes it. This deprioritization occurs only when the system has enough data to trust the behavior without constant monitoring. Data comes from repetition. Repetition must occur across conditions. If you only act when you feel good, the system learns that the behavior is conditional. Certainty never stabilizes if you act regardless of feeling. The system learns that the behavior is invariant. Certainty consolidates. This is why boredom is such an important signal. Boredom indicates that novelty has faded and repetition is occurring. The system is shifting from learning to automation. Most people abandon behaviors at the boredom phase. They mistake boredom for misalignment. In reality, boredom is the gateway to identity integration. High performers stay. Another key factor in certainty formation is time horizon. The system discounts future outcomes heavily. Immediate experience dominates prediction. This is why short-term consistency outweighs long-term planning. The brain trusts what happened yesterday more than what you promise will happen next year. Daily execution is disproportionately powerful. Certainty is also asymmetric. It is easier to destroy than to build. A few emotionally charged failures can destabilize belief if not handled correctly. This is why emotional regulation matters, not to feel better, but to protect the evidence. A missed execution should be emotionally flat. No narrative, no identity interpretation, just data. High performers are ruthless about this. They do not allow one data point to contaminate the data set. They understand that certainty is fragile during formation. They protect it structurally, not emotionally. Once certainty stabilizes, something interesting happens. Effort perception drops. The same action feels lighter, not because it requires less energy, but because resistance has been removed. Resistance was never the work. Resistance was uncertainty. When uncertainty disappears, effort feels clean. This is why people describe identity-aligned action as effortless. It is not effortless, it is frictionless. Friction is internal conflict. Conflict disappears when prediction is stable. At this stage, confidence is no longer something you check. It is assumed. You stop thinking about whether you can do the thing. You simply do it. This is dangerous for people addicted to self-evaluation. Progress becomes quiet. There is no emotional spike, no sense of becoming someone new. You are no longer becoming. You are operating. This is the point where most people underestimate how far they have come. They feel normal again and assume nothing changed. In reality, identity has locked. Certainty is complete when behavior persists without monitoring. You no longer track whether you feel confident. You track whether the input ran. Eventually, you stop tracking that too. At that point, the behavior is no longer something you do. It is something that happens. This is the endpoint of certainty engineering, not belief, not motivation, not confidence, predictability. In the next chapter, you will see how predictability converts into a new operational identity, why identity only locks when behavior becomes boringly reliable, and how to prevent regression once this phase is reached. Chapter 14. Identity Locks. When behavior becomes predictable. Identity does not change when you decide who you want to be. It changes when the system can reliably predict what you will do. This distinction is non-negotiable. Identity is not aspirational. It is statistical. It is the brain's best guess about future behavior based on observed patterns. When that guess stabilizes, identity locks. This is why identity change feels slow and then sudden. For a long time, nothing appears to happen. Behavior feels effortful. Resistance persists. Doubt remains active. Under the surface, the system is collecting data. Once the data reaches a threshold, prediction shifts. The shift feels abrupt because prediction is binary. Either the behavior is reliable or it is not. There is no partial identity. Before the lock, behavior feels like something you are doing against yourself. After the lock, behavior feels like something you are doing as yourself. This transition is subtle but decisive. Most people abandon change just before the lock occurs. They mistake the prolonged discomfort of the pre-lock phase for evidence that the system is incompatible with them. In reality, the system is still unconvinced. High performers expect this phase. They do not look for emotional confirmation. They look for behavioral stability. Identity locks only when the system observes the same behavior under varying conditions. Energy, mood, stress, confidence, and context must all vary while execution remains intact. This variability is essential. If you only act when conditions are ideal, the system learns a conditional rule. This behavior depends on circumstances. Conditional behaviors never integrate. To lock identity, behavior must appear invariant. This is why consistency under low motivation matters more than intensity under high motivation. The system trusts what survives indifference. Another critical requirement for identity lock is boredom. Boredom signals that novelty has been exhausted. The system is no longer learning whether the behavior will occur. It is learning that it will. Most people misinterpret boredom as stagnation. They seek stimulation, variation, or escalation. This interrupts consolidation. High performers resist this urge. They allow repetition to become dull. Dullness is the price of predictability. Predictability is what identity is built from. Identity also locks faster when execution is unremarkable. Dramatic effort attracts attention and emotional tagging. The system may categorize it as exceptional. Quiet execution blends into the background. It feels normal. Normal is what the system adopts. This is why public declarations often slow identity change. They add pressure, expectation, and evaluation. Evaluation increases emotional volatility. Volatility delays integration. High performers often change privately, not out of secrecy but out of efficiency. Another factor that accelerates identity lock is removing narrative. When you stop telling stories about what you are doing, why it matters, how hard it is, what it says about you, the system records cleaner data. Narrative amplifies emotion. Emotion distorts memory. Distorted memory destabilizes prediction. Identity prefers silence. This is also why self-labeling too early backfires. Saying "I am disciplined now" before behavior is stable creates a prediction error when inconsistency appears. The system resolves the error by downgrading the label. High performers let identity be inferred, not announced. Once identity locks, something important changes. Resistance disappears without effort. This does not mean the behavior becomes easy. It means the behavior becomes unquestioned. There is no internal debate, no emotional bargaining, no need for justification. The action occurs because it is expected. At this stage, the system actively protects the new identity. Skipping the behavior produces discomfort. Execution produces relief. The loop has inverted. What once required discipline now requires discipline not to do. This is the point where people say, "I'd feel weird if I didn't do it." That feeling is identity enforcement. Identity enforcement is powerful. It is also dangerous if misaligned. This is why accidental identities persist for decades. But when deliberately engineered, identity enforcement removes reliance on willpower permanently. Regression at this stage is rare but not impossible. It usually occurs under two conditions: prolonged stress without input delivery or environmental changes that remove structural support. High performers anticipate this. They protect core inputs even during disruption. They simplify rather than abandon. Identity does not require optimal conditions. It requires continuity. Another sign of identity lock is compression. The behavior takes less mental space. You stop tracking it closely. Attention shifts elsewhere. This is healthy. It indicates automation. Trying to keep the behavior emotionally salient after lock can destabilize it. Over-monitoring reintroduces evaluation. Evaluation reintroduces choice. High performers move on. They let the system run. This is why elite individuals can manage multiple demanding identities simultaneously. Each one has already locked. They are not managing behavior. They are managing inputs at a higher level. Once identity locks, growth requires expanding boundaries again. The process repeats. New resistance appears. New uncertainty arises. This does not mean the identity was false. It means it is time to extend it. Identity is not static. It is hierarchical. You do not abandon old identities to build new ones. You stack them. This stacking is what creates exponential capability. In the next chapter, you will see how to design systems where failure becomes statistically irrelevant, why bad days stop mattering, and how high performers think in volume instead of perfection. Chapter 15. Making failure statistically irrelevant. Most people fear failure because they treat each failure as a verdict. High performers treat failure as noise. This difference is not emotional. It is mathematical. Failure only matters when volume is low. When volume is high enough, individual data points lose significance. The system stops interpreting variance as meaning. Most people operate at low volume. Each attempt carries emotional weight because each attempt feels decisive. This makes failure feel personal, even when it is statistically meaningless. High performers design volume deliberately. They understand that any single execution is unreliable. Mood fluctuates, energy fluctuates, circumstances fluctuate. Expecting consistency at the micro level is unrealistic. Instead, they pursue consistency at the aggregate level. This is the core shift, from "did this work" to "how many times did this run?" Volume changes how the evidence loop behaves. At low volume, each outcome is emotionally amplified. Memory distorts. Belief becomes volatile. Identity oscillates. At high volume, outcomes average out. The system learns the trend, not the exception. Prediction stabilizes. This is why high performers are calm after bad days. The bad day does not threaten the dataset. Failure becomes irrelevant not because it disappears, but because it is diluted. This dilution is intentional. Volume also neutralizes perfectionism. When the goal is to run the input many times, quality naturally varies. This variance is expected. The system stops demanding optimal performance every time. Perfectionism thrives when stakes feel absolute. Volume makes stakes relative. Another effect of volume is desensitization. Repeated exposure to imperfection reduces emotional reactivity. The system stops tagging mistakes as threats. This allows learning to accelerate. Most people try to avoid failure. High performers try to outnumber it. This does not mean recklessness. It means accepting that error is part of the distribution. The key is ensuring that errors are survivable. Catastrophic failures teach avoidance. Minor failures teach adaptation. High performers design systems where errors are small and frequent, not rare and devastating. This is why they iterate quickly. Speed increases volume. Volume reduces emotional load per attempt. Slow systems magnify failure. Fast systems absorb it. Another reason failure feels devastating to most people is identity fusion. They tie outcomes directly to self-concept. When something goes wrong, identity is threatened. High performers decouple identity from individual outcomes. Identity is tied to running the system, not winning each instance. This decoupling is structural, not philosophical. When success is defined as input completion, failure loses the power to define self-worth. Self-worth becomes irrelevant to execution. This also changes risk tolerance. When failure is statistically irrelevant, risk becomes manageable. People take action earlier, they test more, they learn faster. Low-volume systems avoid risk because each failure feels costly. High-volume systems exploit risk because the cost is spread. This is why innovation clusters among people with high output. They are not braver. They are less exposed to single-point failure. Another overlooked benefit of volume is identity resilience. When identity is built on thousands of repetitions, it cannot be destabilized by a few misses. This is why relapse becomes temporary rather than catastrophic. A lapse is absorbed into the dataset. The trend remains intact. High performers do not panic after lapses. Panic is a signal of fragile identity. Fragile identities require constant reassurance. Robust identities require none. Volume builds robustness. Volume also clarifies signal. Over time, patterns emerge. What works becomes obvious. What doesn't fades without drama. This clarity cannot be achieved through analysis alone. It requires data. Most people overthink because they underproduce. Producing more simplifies thinking. Another critical feature of making failure irrelevant is time horizon. High performers think in decades, not days. Short-term fluctuations lose meaning. This is not optimism, it is scale. At sufficient scale, outcomes converge. This convergence creates inevitability. When inputs are delivered at sufficient volume over sufficient time, the probability of the desired outcome approaches certainty. Not because of belief, but because alternatives are exhausted. Failure becomes unlikely not because you avoided it, but because you overwhelmed it. This is why high performers are patient. They are not waiting, they are accumulating. Accumulation is invisible until it isn't. Most people quit before accumulation becomes visible. High performers do not quit because quitting would require ignoring the data. At this stage, something important shifts. Failure no longer produces shame or doubt. It produces curiosity. Curiosity is the emotional state of someone whose identity is secure. This is the final signal that failure is irrelevant. In the next and final chapter, you will see what it means to live as the inevitable outcome, how maintenance replaces effort, and why identity-aligned life feels quiet rather than dramatic. Chapter 16. Living as the inevitable outcome. At this stage, nothing feels dramatic. This is unsettling for people who equate change with intensity. They expect transformation to feel powerful, emotional, or validating. Instead, what emerges is quiet inevitability. That quiet is the signal. When identity, inputs, and environment align, effort disappears not because work is gone, but because conflict is gone. There is no longer an internal debate about whether to act. The system already knows what happens next. This is what it means to live as the inevitable outcome. Inevitability is not confidence. It is not optimism. It is not belief. It is the absence of alternative paths that feel plausible. At this point, the behavior does not feel like a strategy. It feels like maintenance. Just as you do not feel disciplined for brushing your teeth, you do not feel disciplined for executing the inputs that define your life. They are simply what occurs. Most people misunderstand this phase because they expect reward. They expect to feel accomplished. They expect arrival. There is no arrival. There is only continuation. This is why high performers often feel strangely underwhelmed by success. The outcome confirms what the system already assumed. Emotionally, nothing new is learned. The system does not celebrate inevitability. It relies on it. This is also why external validation loses power. Praise does not change execution. Criticism does not destabilize it. Identity is no longer externally negotiated. When behavior is inevitable, feedback becomes informational instead of emotional. This is freedom. Freedom is not the ability to do anything at any time. Freedom is the absence of internal resistance to what must be done. At this stage, motivation is irrelevant. You may feel motivated or not. Execution does not change. Emotion floats on top of behavior rather than steering it. This is often misinterpreted as rigidity. In reality, it creates flexibility at a higher level. Because core inputs are stable, experimentation becomes safe. You can explore without risking collapse. You can fail without identity threat. You can adapt without losing continuity. This is why elite performers innovate more, not less. Their foundation is locked. Living as the inevitable outcome also changes how you relate to time. You stop rushing. Urgency fades, not because goals disappeared, but because trajectory is secure. You know where this goes if inputs continue. This knowledge is not reassuring. It is neutral. Neutrality is stability. Another shift occurs here. Attention frees up. When execution is automated, cognitive bandwidth becomes available. This is when people expand into new domains, take on larger problems, or simplify aggressively. This is not ambition increasing. It is overhead decreasing. Maintenance replaces effort. Maintenance is often misunderstood as stagnation. It is the opposite. Maintenance preserves the conditions for compounding. Without maintenance, systems decay. With it, growth becomes optional rather than necessary for identity validation. This is why people who reach this phase stop chasing self-improvement content. There's nothing left to optimize at the level of behavior. The system is running. Any further change requires choosing a new identity boundary and repeating the process deliberately. This is the final test of understanding. Most people want change to be emotional so they can feel different. High performers accept change that is structural, even if it feels ordinary. Ordinary execution produces extraordinary accumulation. Another critical feature of this phase is responsibility. When behavior is inevitable, excuses disappear. There is no story about why something didn't happen. Either the input ran or it didn't. This clarity is uncomfortable for those addicted to narrative. It is liberating for those committed to agency. Agency at this level does not feel empowering. It feels factual. You are no longer someone who is trying. You are someone whose system produces outcomes. This does not mean life becomes easy. Difficulty still exists. Stress still appears. Unexpected events still occur. The difference is that none of these threaten identity. Identity is now upstream of circumstance. This is why regression becomes rare, not because it is impossible, but because it requires dismantling a system that is clearly working. The cost is obvious. Most regressions happen when people stop maintaining inputs under the illusion that identity will persist without them. Identity is durable, not permanent. High performers respect this. They protect core behaviors even when scaling, delegating, or resting. They simplify before they stop. Rest is part of maintenance, not a break from it. At the highest level, living as the inevitable outcome feels almost impersonal. You no longer dramatize your journey. You no longer center yourself in the story. You focus on inputs. The rest unfolds. This is why high performers are often difficult to interview. They do not have inspiring explanations. They describe routines, constraints, and boring repetition. There is nothing else to say. The system works. This book was never about motivation, mindset, or belief in the abstract. It was about engineering inevitability through controllable inputs, repeated under tolerable stress, long enough for identity to lock. You were never broken. You were never lazy. You were never lacking discipline. You were preserving an identity. Now you know how identities are built. From here, the choice is simple, not easy. Either you continue feeding the old system by default, or you deliberately install the next one. Reality will reflect whichever you maintain, not because it cares, but because it has no alternative. Action is the only interface with reality. Beliefs change through evidence. Consistency beats intensity. You do not need motivation. You need inevitability.